He mocked a deaf orphan, laughing at his vulnerability, until the bull charged at the millionaire instead. What happens next will leave you speechless. The laughter cut across the square like a whip. Kean Rourke froze where he stood, his small notebook clutched tightly against his chest. He had been passing by the livestock pens, scribbling notes for the stable hands who sometimes asked him to keep track of feeding schedules. The noise of the crowd, the bleating of goats, the stamping of hooves, the metallic clang of vendors hammering signs, was nothing to him. Silence was his world, silence and vibration. But he did not need to hear the words to understand what was happening. He saw the faces. He saw the mocking eyes. Cassian Trouvé had stepped into the middle of the square, the polished silver tip of his cane tapping against the stones. He moved with the confidence of a man who owned half the town and wanted the other half to believe he owned them too. His companions, 4 men dressed in tailored coats and smug expressions, stood just behind him, waiting for his signal, ready to laugh at whatever cruelty he decided to unleash. Cassian suddenly staggered forward, his body twisting in an exaggerated wobble, his arms flailing as though he had lost control of them. His mouth opened wide in a grotesque, drawn-out expression. It was a mockery of speechlessness, a caricature of silence. His men burst out laughing, their voices echoing across the crowded square. Kean's fingers tightened around the notebook. His chest ached with a heat he did not want to show. He lowered his head, trying to keep walking, but Cassian was not finished. "Careful, boy," Cassian called, though Kean could only see the shape of his lips forming the words. He had grown used to reading mouths, catching fragments of meaning even when men spoke with mockery instead of care. "Don't trip over your own shadow. Or maybe you cannot hear where it is." The entourage roared again, elbowing one another as though this display were the height of wit. Kean stopped. He looked at them. His eyes, dark and steady, revealed nothing. Inside, however, the words cut like cold iron. He wanted to shout, to strike, to remind them that silence did not mean weakness. But the town square was full, and all eyes would turn against him if he dared defy a man like Cassian Trouvé. He lowered his gaze once more and walked on, clutching the notebook like a shield. Behind him, Cassian smirked, pleased by his performance. The millionaire adjusted his cuffs, satisfied that the orphan had given him no resistance. He turned back to his men, soaking in their admiration. "Pathetic, isn't it?" His lips shaped the words for all to see. "The town keeps him because it needs a reminder of what misfortune looks like." Kean quickened his pace, moving away from the sting of their laughter, but each step carried a weight he could not shake. He had grown used to being an outsider, used to the looks that measured him not as a boy, but as a flaw. Yet no matter how many times it happened, the humiliation always returned with the same burn. By the time dusk settled over the square, Kean had slipped away to the quieter edge of town, where the festival preparations were stored in barns and stables. Here, the air smelled of hay and earth, and the shadows grew long over the wooden fences. Few men lingered here after dark, especially near the enclosure of the bull named Venar. The beast was massive, a dark-coated wall of muscle and fury. His horns curled like sharpened scythes, his eyes burned with restless anger, and his reputation for breaking handlers' arms kept most men at a distance. But not Kean. The boy crouched by the wooden fence, slipping through a narrow gap he had discovered weeks ago. In his hands was a small bundle wrapped in cloth, dried fruit and scraps of bread saved from the meals he received at the lodge. He laid them out on the ground, just beyond the reach of the bull's heavy snout. At first Venar snorted, pawing at the earth with impatient hooves. His breath misted in the cooling air, and his muscles twitched with restrained energy. Kean waited, still and calm. Slowly, cautiously, the bull lowered his head and sniffed the food. A rumble passed through his chest, deep and uncertain, before he ate. Kean smiled faintly. He raised a hand and pressed it gently against the thick wooden slats. The bull's head lifted, eyes watching him closely. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. Then Venar stepped closer, his massive weight shaking the ground. He pushed his muzzle against the fence, close enough for Kean to feel the warm breath across his fingers. The boy pressed his palm against the creature's muzzle. For a moment, time dissolved. It was not boy and beast, not orphan and outcast. It was simply two beings who recognized something in each other. The bull snorted again but did not move away. His ears flicked, and his heavy head dipped slightly, a gesture so gentle it felt impossible from a beast so feared. Kean closed his eyes. He could not hear, but he could feel. The vibration of the ground, the pulse of life in the bull's breath, the quiet understanding that they were both bound by mistrust from others. Where the world saw danger, Kean saw kinship. The boy stayed until the stars rose, feeding Venar scraps and scribbling a few notes in his book by lantern light. He wrote not for others to read, but for himself, to remember, to anchor his thoughts in words he could not speak. One line he underlined twice. He is not wild to me. When he finally slipped back out through the fence, Kian glanced once more at the bull. Vaynar's massive form was half hidden in shadow, but the boy knew he was watching. A silent guardian, a reflection of strength he wished he possessed. The path back to the lodge was quiet, but Kian's mind was not. He replayed Cassian's mockery, the laughter of men who held power and wealth. Each sneer replayed itself in memory, louder than the silence that usually cocooned his world. He did not know how, but he felt certain something was coming. The festival was not just a parade of cattle and coin this year. It would become something more, something that might decide whether he remained a shadow or became something stronger. He stepped into the darkness of the lodge, his notebook still pressed to his chest, and whispered the words only in thought, though no one could hear them. The stage is set. The arrogant millionaire, the mocked orphan, and the beast that may yet tip the scales of power. Trumpets blared, their brass bells flashing in the sun, and banners of crimson and gold unfurled above the crowded square. Dancers spun in circles, their boots striking the cobblestones with thunderous rhythm, while drummers pounded steady beats that echoed through the festival. Children ran between the stalls with wooden toys shaped like oxen, men shouted prices over one another, and the air smelled of roasted meat, cider, and dust. The livestock festival had begun, dazzling and chaotic, every corner alive with motion. In the decorated balcony above the square sat Cassian Trouve. He leaned back in a carved oak chair draped in velvet, a goblet of spiced wine in hand, surveying the scene below like a king watching his subjects. His dark hair gleamed with oil, his coat shimmered with gold embroidery, and a sapphire pin glittered at his collar. Around him lounged his companions, men who owed him favors or feared losing his patronage, laughing at every remark he made. Below, Kian Rourke slipped quietly between handlers, clutching his worn notebook. His task was simple: track the feeding times and note the details that the stable hands sometimes missed in the chaos. The boy moved carefully, skirting the edge of the crowd, blending into the background. His silence made him almost invisible, yet Cassian's eyes, sharp and predatory, picked him out of the sea of faces. The millionaire's lips curved into a sly smile. He reached into his coat, pulled a polished silver coin, and with a flick of his wrist, tossed it toward the cobblestones. The coin struck the ground with a metallic ring, rolling to a stop near Kian's boots. Cassian leaned forward, voice rich with mockery, his lips forming words clear enough for Kian to catch. "Fetch it, like a dog." The men on the balcony burst into laughter, some slapping the table, others doubling over as though it were the finest joke of the day. The sound rolled across the square, drawing uneasy stares from the townsfolk. A few shifted uncomfortably, but none dared rebuke a man as powerful as Cassian Trouve. Kian stared at the coin for a long moment. His chest tightened, but his expression did not falter. He bent down, not to take the coin, but to pick up his notebook where the impact had jolted it loose. Straightening, he dusted it off, his hands steady, his face calm. Without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving the coin to glimmer in the dirt. The balcony fell momentarily silent. Cassian blinked, the smile fading from his lips. He had expected shame, perhaps even anger, but the boy's indifference unsettled him. For an instant, Cassian's jaw tightened, though he quickly masked it with a scoff and a forced laugh. "Too proud even to crawl," he muttered, lifting his goblet again. His companions joined in the laughter, but their voices lacked the earlier confidence. The parade continued. Bulls adorned with ribbons and polished horns led through the square to the judge's stand. Farmers bowed, hoping for recognition, while merchants called out their offers. Cassian watched with growing impatience, his interest waning as the day wore on. He wanted spectacle, something dramatic, something that proved his place above the rest. By late afternoon, he left his balcony and strolled into the livestock pens with his entourage. The narrow paths between the enclosures smelled of sweat and hay, alive with the bellow of beasts. Cassian walked with his cane tapping rhythmically against the packed earth, his men following close behind. He inspected the animals with a practiced eye, making grand pronouncements about their breeding as if his word alone conferred value. Then his gaze fell on the largest enclosure. Inside stood Vaynar. The bull's dark coat gleamed with a sheen of sweat, muscles rippling beneath the hide. His eyes glowed with a restless fire, and every exhale sent clouds of dust into the air. Even behind the thick wooden fence, his presence radiated danger. Cassian's lips curved upward. "Ah," he said, gesturing with his cane. "Now here is a beast worth noting. See the size, the breadth, feral, untamed. No wonder the handlers keep their distance." One of his men chuckled nervously. "They say he's near impossible to control." "Impossible?" Cassian scoffed, removing a silk handkerchief from his pocket. "Nothing is impossible when one commands respect. Even animals know who stands above them." He stepped closer to the fence. Vaynar's ears twitched, nostrils flaring. The bull stamped the ground, the vibration carrying through the earth. Cassian, mistaking menace for submission, lifted the handkerchief and waved it lazily, as though teasing the beast. From the shadows at the far end of the pens, Kian froze. He had been carrying a bundle of rope for the handlers, moving unnoticed as usual, when he spotted Cassian approaching Vaynar. His chest tightened. He knew that stance, that arrogance. The bull hated sudden movement, hated taunting gestures. Kian's heart pounded in silent alarm. "Stop," he mouthed desperately, though his voice could not carry. He raised a hand, a useless plea swallowed by the distance. Cassian continued, his smirk widening as he twirled the handkerchief, stepping even closer to the fence. "Look at him. He knows who holds the power here. He only pretends at rage." Vaynar's muscles coiled. He lowered his head, horns angled forward, hooves scraping the dirt with rapid strikes. Dust rose in clouds. Kian's breath caught. He felt it in the ground, in his bones, the shift, the gathering storm of motion. Dramatic irony cut through the moment. Cassian saw only dominance, while Kian knew the truth. The bull was seconds away from unleashing everything. "Cassian," one of the men muttered, unease creeping into his voice. "Perhaps—" The words were cut off by a roar of splintering wood. With terrifying force, Vaynar lunged forward, shattering the enclosure. The fence exploded into shards, boards flying like missiles. The ground shook as the bull burst free, his massive body surging forward in a blur of muscle and fury. The crowd erupted into chaos. Screams filled the air, handlers shouted, children cried, and men leapt aside to avoid the charging beast. Stalls overturned, animals scattered, and the once orderly pen dissolved into pandemonium. Cassian stumbled back, his eyes wide, his handkerchief fluttering from his grip. For the first time, the mask of arrogance slipped, revealing raw terror. He had thought the bull would charge at the silent boy nearby, the orphan he had mocked and belittled. But in that instant, he realized his mistake. The bull's blazing eyes were fixed on him. Cassian tried to retreat, his polished boots slipping in the dust, but the beast was already upon him. Vaynar's hooves tore up the ground, his horns lowered, his body a wall of unstoppable force. The millionaire's smirk vanished as his arrogance crumbled into raw fear. The stampede ripped through the festival grounds like thunder breaking the earth. Men shouted, stalls toppled, and the air filled with dust and fragments of hay carried on the wild pounding of hooves. Panic spread in all directions, bodies pressing and stumbling as everyone ran for their lives. Yet amid the chaos, one figure did not flee. Kian remained rooted, his eyes fixed on the surging form of Vaynar, the bull that had shattered its pen with terrifying force. The great animal charged toward the center of the grounds, his horns lowered and his muscles rolling like waves under a storm. The crowd scattered before him, but one man did not escape in time. Cassian fell hard into the dirt, his fine jacket catching on a splintered cart as he scrambled backward. His face drained of color as the beast bore down, and for the first time in his life, he seemed stripped of power, just another man facing something greater than wealth or name. Kian's breath quickened, but not with fear. His hands moved instinctively toward the pocket of his worn trousers where a carved wooden whistle waited. The boy had carved it himself, sanding it until the edges were smooth and carrying it to the festival grounds for weeks, testing it in secret whenever he dared. Though he could not hear, he had always felt vibration like a language of its own, and the whistle produced a tone Vaynar had learned to respond to during stolen moments of trust. He darted forward through the madness, weaving between men who shouted at him to turn back. A barrel rolled across the path, but he leaped it with surprising speed. Dust stung his eyes, but his focus did not waver. Cassian was cornered, cowering against the hay cart, raising his arms as if coins or titles could protect him from horns sharpened by nature itself. The irony struck Kian even in the heat of the moment. The man who had mocked him now trembled like a child before the very beast he believed would be his spectacle of control. Kian pressed the whistle to his lips and blew. No sound reached his ears, but the ground vibrated faintly, and he watched Vaynar's head twitch mid-charge. The bull slowed, stamping the ground with furious hooves, confused but not yet calmed. The crowd gasped at the sight, their cries echoing through the dusty square. Whispers started to ripple. "The boy! The orphan! He's stopping it!" Some even forgot their fear long enough to stand and stare. The bull tossed his head, sides heaving, his dark eyes flashing toward Kian. The boy moved closer, step by steady step, his palms open and his chest rising with sharp breaths. He had always known this day might come, when courage would demand more than silent endurance. Now, with Cassian shivering in the dirt, he seized the moment. Kian reached the post where he had hidden the coil of rope days earlier. His fingers closed around it quickly, tugging the rough fiber free. The plan had never been to save Cassian. Never. It had been about proving something to himself, to Vaynar, to anyone who ever doubted that a deaf boy could command more than pity. But fate had arranged the stage, and Cassian's life now hung in balance with Kian's choice. Another blow of the whistle, another pulse in the air. Vaynar pawed the ground, his breath steaming in the heat, then swung his head toward Kian, ignoring the trembling man who had been his target moments before. The orphan stepped into the open space, meeting the bull's wild gaze with a calm intensity that came not from arrogance, but from weeks of trust built in shadows. The rope slid across Vaynar's thick neck as Kian eased it into place, each movement deliberate, every gesture meant to steady instead of restrain. The beast snorted but did not lunge. The crowd exhaled as if holding one breath together. Men whispered prayers, others muttered disbelief. "He's guiding it, like a master," someone said from behind a toppled stall. Cassian, sprawled in the dirt, could only gape. His polished boots were coated in mud, his manicured hands scraped raw from scrambling. Never before had he been so small in front of men who once bowed to him. He raised himself halfway, only to fall again when his knees gave out. His eyes darted around, searching for anyone who might restore the balance of power that had slipped away in a heartbeat. Then a sharper cry rose from the crowd. One of Cassian's own men, a tall figure in a crimson vest, snatched up a pitchfork from a broken cart. His face burned with desperation, fear of scandal, fear of losing the master whose coin filled his purse. With reckless haste, he sprinted toward Vaynar, raising the weapon high. The crowd gasped again, a single sound of dread. Kian turned sharply, his body moving before thought could catch up. He flung himself between the bull and the man, his arms outstretched, eyes blazing with defiance. "Stop!" he shouted, though his own ears caught nothing of the sound. His voice cracked, rough from disuse, but it carried enough force to freeze the attacker mid-stride. Vaynar stamped hard, dust exploding upward, a warning no one could mistake. The pitchfork wavered, but the man gritted his teeth, ready to strike regardless. Before he could lunge, several townsfolk surged forward from the edges of the crowd. Rough hands caught his arms, wrenching the weapon away. Others pressed him down into the dirt, shouting accusations of madness and cowardice. Kian stood still, chest rising and falling, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. The bull remained beside him, quiet now, as though acknowledging the boy's courage. The scene froze in time. Cassian, humiliated and broken, his hired protector pinned in disgrace, and the orphan standing tall with a beast at his side. The whispers grew louder, no longer just murmurs but voices carrying across the festival grounds. "The boy saved us. The bull follows him. Cassian," he begged in the dirt. What had begun as chaos had shifted into revelation. The crowd no longer looked at Cassian with awe. Their eyes turned to Kian, who had shown no fear when power faltered. Cassian's humiliation was absolute. His wealth could not hide the tremor in his limbs, nor could his title erase the sight burned into every witness's mind, him begging for life while a deaf orphan stood unshaken. And worse still, it was his own people, the very men he paid to ensure control, who had been forced to strike down one of their own to keep him safe. As the dust began to settle, the truth of what had happened spread like fire through dry grass. Kian did not raise his fists, nor did he speak long words. Yet his defiance had struck harder than any blow. Cassian's downfall was not in the horns of the bull, but in the way the crowd saw him, stripped of dignity beside the silent courage of the boy he had mocked. Cassian's humiliation was complete, not just because the bull charged him, but because the very people he commanded now see his cowardice exposed beside the silent courage of the orphan he mocked. The story spread faster than smoke over dry grass. Within a single day, every tavern in Evershade echoed with talk of the boy who had faced down a bull. By the second day, the tale traveled to neighboring villages, retold with gestures of horns and wide-eyed amazement. Some spoke of Kian as if he were a beast whisperer. Others swore he carried no fear in his veins, only a silent power that words could never reach. Kian, however, did not walk with the pride others claimed for him. He moved quietly through the streets, still half expecting to feel the sting of mockery on his back. But instead of cruel laughter, men tipped their heads to him, boys trailed behind in admiration, and merchants offered him fruit from their stalls. It was as though the ground itself had shifted beneath him. The orphan, once invisible, was now the center of every gaze. Cassian's fall was even swifter. He limped back to his manor with his clothes in tatters and his pride shattered, only to find that humiliation followed him like a shadow. Whispers of his cowardice reached the investors who funded his ventures. Letters arrived within days, neat signatures cutting ties with him one after another. His wealth had not vanished, but its roots were exposed, and men of commerce preferred distance from a man who had begged in the dirt before a crowd. In his bitterness, Cassian struck back. He summoned a gathering in the square, declaring in a loud, quivering voice that the orphan had conspired with the bull. He claimed that Kian had lured the beast from its pen, intending to bring him shame. "The boy is not a savior," Cassian barked, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the crowd. "He is a danger to this town." His face shone with sweat, and though his voice reached high, it carried the desperation of a man already half forgotten. The people did not stir in his favor. Men crossed their arms, women shook their heads, and even children whispered that they had seen the truth with their own eyes. One villager, a gray-bearded mason, stepped forward and said, "We all watched, Cassian. It was not the boy who mocked fate. It was you." Laughter broke out, not cruel but sharp, and Cassian's cheeks burned red as he retreated, his words left hanging like rotten fruit. The parish council met shortly after, speaking in hushed tones around their long oak table. They invited Kian to stand before them, his hands clasped nervously, his shoulders tense beneath his threadbare shirt. "You showed more care than men twice your age," said Alden, the eldest of the council, his deep voice firm but kind. "The grounds need a hand such as yours. We ask that you serve as apprentice caretaker." Kian blinked, uncertain if he had understood. The counselor beside Alden leaned closer, shaping each word slowly so Kian could read his lips. The boy's chest tightened, a warmth spreading through him that no fire had ever given. He nodded quickly, almost too many times, his hands trembling with the weight of belonging. For the first time, he was not simply being tolerated, he was being chosen. From that day, the festival grounds changed. Venar, the bull once deemed too wild for safety, was kept under special care. Kian spent hours each morning brushing the dust from his hide, guiding him to water, and walking alongside him in the quiet fields. The bond between them deepened, not forged by reins or whips, but by patience, trust, and an understanding beyond sound. The villagers often paused to watch, men leaning on fence posts, boys imitating Kian's steady steps, and whispers carried a new respect. The boy and the bull, as one. Yet peace did not fully settle. Cassian's estate, though weakened, still loomed on the hill like a storm cloud. Servants came and went with hurried faces, and rumors told of debts piling, land disputes surfacing, and lawyers arriving in the dead of night. It was during one of Kian's new duties, clearing out the items Cassian had abandoned in the council's care, that the final twist revealed itself. Among crates of silks and ledgers bound in fine leather, Kian found a book heavier than the rest. Its pages were filled with columns of numbers, signatures, and stamped seals. At first he thought it a record of trade, but as his eyes traced the names, he noticed patterns. Plots of land sold for far less than their worth, estates transferred without witness, signatures repeated in ways that felt too neat, too copied. He turned the book over in his hands, his pulse quickening. Though deaf, he could sense meaning in what he saw. Cassian's fortune was no mountain of gold earned honestly, but a tower built on stolen stones. Kian carried the ledger to the council, laying it upon their table without hesitation. He tapped the pages with urgency, his gaze steady. The council members read in silence, their expressions darkening line by line. When Alden finally closed the book, his hand pressed flat against its cover, his eyes were heavy with certainty. "This," he said grimly, "is the end of Cassian Daler." Weeks later, the courthouse filled with townsfolk. Men pressed against the windows, boys clung to railings, and even travelers stopped to witness the trial of the fallen millionaire. Kian stood in the back, Venar waiting outside with a calm patience that mirrored his handlers. The boy could not hear the verdicts, the speeches, or the cries of outrage, but he saw them. He saw Cassian's face crumble as each page of the ledger was laid bare before the judge. He saw investors rise from their benches and walk out, leaving him alone. He saw the crowd lean toward the council, nodding in agreement as the empire collapsed before their eyes. The irony struck sharper than any blow. Cassian, who once laughed at the silence of an orphan, now found himself stripped of voice, powerless against truth. Kian did not speak, yet his actions had carried a louder sound than any words could. When the trial ended, the crowd spilled into the square. Some clapped Kian on the back, others pressed fruit or coins into his hands, but he needed none of it. His eyes found Venar beyond the gates, the bull waiting calmly, a symbol of all that had changed. He reached out, brushing the coarse hair between the horns, and felt no longer the loneliness of an outsider. He had earned his place not by words, but by a strength of character no ridicule could erase. Kian, standing beside Venar, no longer feels like an outsider. He has earned a place not by speaking words, but by showing the strength of character no ridicule could erase. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of empathy, social injustice, and the profound unspoken connections between a human and an animal. This narrative aims to highlight that true worth transcends material possessions and that compassion can be found in the most unlikely of places.